You remember when we first started looking at Judges that I gave you a list of things that were kind of common to all the different accounts. The Israelites would leave God behind, worship other gods, and God would bring in an enemy to conquer them. When they came to their senses, they would cry out to God, and God would raise up a deliverer, and he would get them free from the oppressors. They would go back to worshiping God, and then there would be a period of peace, usually 40 to 80 years of peace. All right, throw all that out. That's not what we're going to talk about tonight. Let me give you a pop quiz. Who was the first king in Israel? You're going to say Saul, aren't you? Well, you're wrong. It's this guy Abimelech that we're going to talk about tonight. Now, if you wanted to ask the question, who was the first God-chosen king in Israel, then Saul is the right answer. He was the first one anointed by a prophet of God, by Samuel, to take on the role of king. But he wasn't the first one that somebody appointed king in Israel. So we're going to look at the town, the area around Shechem, and the kingdom, the short-lived kingdom, of a guy named Abimelech. So go over to Judges chapter 9, and we're going to start reading in verse 1. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal. Who is Jerubbaal? That's Gideon. All right. He went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them, to all of his mother's clan, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and your blood. So let me remind us of one of the things we noticed about Gideon after he won his battle. The guy had a whole bunch of wives, and he had one concubine, and his one concubine had one son. So we have the 70 sons of Gideon, Jerubbaal, who are kind of aristocracy. They asked Gideon, won't you become our king? And he said, I'm not going to be your king, and my sons are not going to be your king. So he abdicates before they ever coronate him. He won't let his family do that. But this Abimelech is not one of those. He is the son of the concubine. So he is kind of the outsider. He's the lone wolf. He's the one that doesn't belong with the aristocracy of the clan. So keep that in mind. When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is related to us. They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels who became his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the cities of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem and crowned Abimelech to be their king. This guy needs medication and counseling. Right? He doesn't need to be anybody's king. He is not called by God to be king. He is not called by God to be a deliverer. These people are worshiping idols, but they're not calling out to God for assistance. They're not calling out for him to give them the right leader. The reason they choose Abimelech to be their ruler is he's related to us. That's his entire pedigree. He's one of us. His mother, who is a concubine of Jerubbaal, is part of our family. So we think that he would make a good king for us. He asserted himself, and they bought into it. That's how Abimelech becomes the judge, or gets listed as a judge. He becomes the king over Shechem and Millo. Now, his baby brother, Jotham, is the only one that escapes the great massacre when he kills all of his other brothers. And I like to watch period movies from the Middle Ages and from 16th, 17th century England. This is not a surprising thing when you watch those movies. When somebody would come to power, they would very often find every child, legitimate or illegitimate, that was born to that king and just kill them, just get rid of them, so that nobody else would have a claim to the throne. Now, he doesn't have a huge throne. He doesn't have a huge kingdom. He's basically got two communities that have inaugurated him as king over their little area, but he goes and he wipes out his entire group of half-brothers. Why do you think he does that? I don't think it's because he thinks they want to be king. I think it's a jealousy thing. I think he was raised on the outside, and those 70 were raised as heroes. As long as Gideon was alive, his 70 sons were going to be the most popular kids in town. Abimelech, on the other hand, lives somewhere else, is not part of the party. He doesn't get invited to be part of the celebration. All right, so when Jotham is told about this, verse 7, he climbed up to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted at them, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you." One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over trees?" Next the tree said to the fig tree, "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" Then the tree said to the vine, "Come and be our king." But the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and humans, to hold sway over the trees?" Finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." The thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let the fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." So he tells this little parable to all of the people that are anointing Abimelech as their king. And his point is this: are you acting honorably? He asked them that several times in the course of this conversation. Are you acting honorably? Do you remember everything that Gideon did for you? And now you've responded by killing all of his children and honoring this son of a concubine. Why would you act like that? What is it about you that makes you think that that's the right thing, the honorable thing to do? And so there's no answer from them. He just runs away because he realizes that now they know where I am and I'm the only son left. So he says what he has to say, and then he beats a hasty retreat and goes somewhere else. So now let's remember, there's no threat from the outside. Right? The 70 sons of Gideon did not form a posse. They just got ambushed and killed. The people of I've lost the name of it. I want to say Shamrock all of a sudden. Shem what? Shechem, thank you. I don't know why I couldn't get Shechem out. It's too close to Shechem and Milo. Those towns were not seeking for God's help or assistance. They've just set in place a thug government. And the question is that honorable? And the answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. So we find out that God is going to intervene, but he's not going to raise up a legitimate judge or somebody that's going to take his place in the Israelite guidance. He's just going to set Abimelech and his allies against each other. Go down to verse 22. After Abimelech had governed Israel 3 years, look at that, 3 years they've got this thug as their king. God stirred up animosity between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, so that they acted treacherously against Abimelech. God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem who helped him murder his brothers. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem set men on the hilltops to ambush and rob everyone who passed by. And then this was reported to Abimelech. So the people of Shechem have had him for a king for 3 years, and it seems like he's kind of an outlaw king. He does pretty much what is in his own best interest. The Shechemites decide that they need some of this money, some of this income, so they become kind of outlaw citizens, and they're mugging people to get their income. So there's nobody in Shechem or Milo that's acting honorably at all, period. You've got a horrible king and a horrible citizenry. Then a fella comes in named Gaal, G-A-A-L, Gaal. And Gaal wants to raise an army against Abimelech. And you almost think, okay, God's going to raise up a deliverer. Maybe this Gaal guy is going to be the deliverer that we need. But go back and look what he said. He's going to turn Shechem and Abimelech against each other. He's going to work this out without necessarily needing anybody. So if you read this middle section about this guy Gaal, you don't really get anywhere. You find out that he tried to raise up a group against Abimelech. The people of Shechem kind of joined behind him, and that raises the animosity level between Abimelech and Shechem. So Shechem decides Abimelech decides he's going to attack his own city. He is the king of Shechem, and his new desire is to wipe out Shechem. Again, this guy needs medication. He needs counseling. He's not doing anything that makes any bit of sense. All right, go down to verse 42, and we'll pick up there. Verse 42. The next day, the people of Shechem went out to the fields, and it was reported to Abimelech. So he took his men and divided them into 3 companies and set an ambush out in the fields. When he saw the people coming out of the city, he rose to attack them. Abimelech and the companies with him rushed forward to a position at the entrance to the city gate. Then 2 companies attacked those in the field and struck them down. All that day Abimelech pressed his attack against the city until he had captured it and killed all of its people. Then he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. So he wipes out everybody that's working out in the fields. He then enters the city, kills all the people that are in the main city. We'll see that there are about 1,000 leftovers that he has to do away with. But then he goes through and breaks down the city, tears down the houses, tears down the businesses, and puts salt over everything. Found out that it was about 200 years before anybody tried to rebuild Shechem. When you get to Jesus' day, Shechem is a place. It's still there. In fact, in David's day, the Ark of the Covenant comes back from the enemy territory, shows up at Shechem. So it's a place that kind of lives on, but during this time frame, their king wipes it out, salts it down so that nothing will grow there in their fields. Now keep going. On hearing this, the citizens in the tower of Shechem went into the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. When Abimelech heard that they had assembled there, he and all of his men went up Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and cut off some branches, lifted them up on his shoulders, and he ordered the men with him, "Quick, do what you've seen me do." So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire with the people still inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. They've done a lot of excavation in the ancient tell there where Shechem used to be, and they think they have found where this thing was. It was, I forgot the dimensions, but over 5,000 square feet, and then a tower. So 1,000 people went and hid out there. In those days, you had an outer wall. That was your first defense. If the enemy got past your outer wall, then there was typically another wall around the inner city. Think, when you hear them talk about Jerusalem and you hear them say the city of David, that's the upper part where David's palace and the temple, that's on up the hill. Jerusalem had a big wall around it, and then there was a secondary wall around the city of David. Well, the Shechemites had a wall, and then they had secondary defenses. He wiped all that out. The last-ditch effort to save yourself was this tower, and a lot of those towns had these places where you could go and fight from the upper stories and maybe hold out for a while. Typically, folks would lay siege to those things and you'd starve to death or whatever. Abimelech says, let's burn them out. And he kills 1,000 people. 3 years ago, these 1,000 people were probably at his inauguration. 3 years ago, they said, we want you for our king. But because of his treachery against his 70 brothers, God worked from the inside. And he made Shechem hate Abimelech, and he made Abimelech hate Shechem. What's the problem so far? Abimelech's winning. Right? Abimelech just wiped out all of the enemy that he had in Shechem. So how do we get rid of Abimelech? Abimelech gets rid of Abimelech. Go all the way back to the beginning of this. Who decided Abimelech needed to be king? Abimelech, right? Who volunteered for the job? Abimelech. He rallies the troops, gets them on his side, gets money from them to hire a mercenary group to fight with him. They kill all of his other brothers except for the baby. And then he rules so unjustly for 3 years that the people of Shechem are mugging people before they can get to Abimelech to pay him whatever they've come to pay him. So there's just animosity there. So he decides that what he needs to do is go besiege and capture the next town over, which is either pronounced Thebes or Thebez, Thebez. And he does exactly the same thing in Thebez that he did in Shechem. Right? It worked once. Let's do the same thing. So he attacks that city. And in attacking it, he was able to kill all the people. He was able to take over the city. And they all retire to a tower, just like the folks in Shechem did. What do you do when people retire to their tower? You burn them out. So Abimelech and his men get their wood together and they get the fire ready to light. And while they're doing it, there is a woman up in the tower window. And it says that she threw an upper millstone out the window and hit Abimelech in the head with it. Okay? So it's raining upper millstones. Now, forgive me, I don't know exactly how big an upper millstone is. It's big enough to crack your head. He realizes that he's dying. So he hurriedly calls for his armor bearer. And when his armor bearer gets to him, he says, please draw your sword and kill me so that no one will say he was killed by a woman. So Abimelech, who was so full of himself and so proud of himself, gets dispatched by a woman throwing a rock out of the top of a tower. And he dies. And that's the end of the story, right? There is no, thus God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also made the people of Shechem pay for all of their wickedness. The curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, came on them. Okay, where's the, how long did it last? Look at chapter 10. After the time of Abimelech, a man of Issachar named Tola, son of Puah, the son of Dodo, rose to save Israel. We just move on to the next guy. So there's no preface of there were so many years that went well. There's no postscript. There were so many years of good after. Evidently, all the folks that were worshiping Baal, that called him to be their king and paid for him to be their king and helped him to wipe out his brothers, all of those get killed off, but nothing really changes on the landscape. So I ask you, how does Abimelech get to have a chapter in Judges? He's not a judge. He's not a good guy. Why do we need to know about Abimelech? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, we need to reinforce the fact that during this time frame, we have no central government. We have a king, but that king is only reigning over a very small territory. And so the overall catchphrase from Judges is, in those days there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, what was right in their own eyes was not always what was right in God's eyes, which brings us to point number 2. These people were living a very self-involved life, and it would seem that they would have been able to get away with it as long as they had the biggest stick, right? They were able to gain ascendancy through attacking other people. Abimelech was able to win whatever battles he seemed to have been fighting. He wasn't having any problem in that sense, but God was watching. So with or without a hero, God takes care of the problem. So in the period of the judges, we're watching as God is the ultimate judge, does what needs to be done. Sometimes he raises up a hero from inside of Israel to take care of it. Sometimes he raises up a hero from outside of Israel to take care of it. And sometimes he just takes care of it. And this time he caused hatred between Shechem and Abimelech, which ended up being Abimelech's undoing. Now, a couple of things that might be similar to the wrong answer to our first trivia question. Can you name 2 kings in Israel who were killed by somebody who was on their side? Abimelech and Saul, right? Saul called for a young man who was actually an Amalekite, but he was an ally, and asked him to kill him before the enemy could get to him, and the young man did. Do you remember what happened to the young man? David killed him, right? David wasn't having it. You can't kill the Lord's elect. Right? So Abimelech is obviously not the Lord's elect. Another similarity between Abimelech and Saul, not exactly the same, but when David received the Spirit of God, when he was anointed by Samuel, and it says the Spirit of the Lord came on David, God gave Saul an evil spirit. You remember reading that? We'll talk about it more here in a few weeks. But he gives to Saul an evil spirit. That's about the time that Saul starts having these massive depressive issues. He becomes kind of a manic depressive. He'll be very happy at times, very sad at times. David comes in to play the harp for him, and he gets so angry he throws his spear at David. Right? That Saul is said to have been given a bad spirit, an evil spirit, an unhappy spirit by the Lord. The Shechemites and Abimelech are at each other's throats because God intervened and made it that way. So there are some similarities between the first self-appointed king in Israel and the first God-appointed king in Israel. But we'll see more about that later on. And I think that was all I wanted to say about that. Any comments or thoughts? No? Okay. If there's a way that we can help you by way of a public response, we would sure love to do that as we sing.